Well, good morning and welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Timothy Walton. I'm a senior fellow here in Hudson's Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. Really grateful that all of you have taken the time for this conversation. Joining us is Dr. Andrew Krepinevich, who, as all of you know, is one of the nation's top defense strategists. Dr. Krepinevich served with distinction in the U.S. Army for 21 years, during which time he wrote a seminal work on U.S. Army's organizational failures in Vietnam, and then also, while working in the Office of Net Assessment, authored The Military Technical Revolution, a preliminary net assessment, or a preliminary assessment, which was a highly formative document that shaped much of the U.S. Department of Defense's thinking regarding the emerging revolution in military affairs. Upon leaving active duty, Dr. Krepinevich founded the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments think tank, where he led and oversaw the development of numerous highly influential concepts, such as air-sea battle, archipelagic defense. And now he is at the Hudson Institute as a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, and he's president and CEO of the Solarium LLC defense consulting firm. We're very pleased to host him to discuss his latest work, The Origins of Victory, which is shown here, and it's a fantastic read, highly recommended to everyone. Your work, Andrew, has played a highly formative role, I think, in my intellectual development, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you, and looking forward to it. So thank you for joining us. I've asked Andrew if he could please share and sort of brief for a bit some of the key findings of his book. I'll ask him a couple questions, and then I can open up the floor to everyone so we can have an enriching conversation. So thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank Morgan as well for her efforts in pulling this together. And thanks for the compliment. Given the way your career has skyrocketed, I take that as quite a compliment. The book is The Origins of Victory. And I guess we'll go to the first slide here, if I can make it work. I can't. There we go. So some of the things I've been working on currently and that are in the works right now, the first two really reflect the book. One is the future of warfare, where war might be headed, and the second is disruptive military innovation. So it's not garden variety innovation; it's big innovation. Third is archipelagic defense, which Hudson should be releasing in September. It's basically an operational concept for the defense of the first island chain in the Western Pacific against you-know-who. Work on deterrence theory. There's a chapter in the book on deterrence theory, the changing character of deterrence, and be glad to respond to any questions you might have on that. And then finally, something that's coming up for me anyway, this issue of the three-body problem. The transition from a bipolar, great nuclear power environment to a tripolar, with China's move to achieve parity with the United States and Russia in terms of its nuclear weapons. But again, the principal focus here is on this era of disruptive change. And I guess the book really, it has two parts, and it really has two themes. The first theme, generally speaking, is that we're in a period of great transition in the character of warfare. And the second is sort of, if you buy that argument, what do you do about it? If you're the U.S. military or if you're any military. And so the maturing precision warfare regime, that warfare regime was introduced in the first Gulf War in 1991. Stealth aircraft, precision weapons, what the Soviet military theorists at the time, before the Soviet Union went into Chapter 11, they said this is the first we've seen of what we've envisioned as a reconnaissance strike complex, this new way of war. And of course, what's happened over the last 30-odd years since the first Gulf War is that regime has matured. And in particular, the Chinese have caught up. The Chinese have their version of a reconnaissance strike complex. The ability to scout over a wide area, to have a battle network that integrates that information and moves it out to the strike element. So those are sort of the three components of a reconnaissance strike complex. And for our military, it implies a big shift, because what happens is we've had this monopoly in what a lot of people call precision warfare for about the last 30 years. And we've developed some very good habits in the sense that we know how to operate in this environment very well, but it's an environment where we had the monopoly. And so having ceded that monopoly, In a sense, we may have to unlearn some bad lessons that we've developed, some bad habits that we've developed when operating in what the military calls a permissive environment, where nobody else can be able to do what we do. Well, now the Chinese at least can do it, and there may be other militaries that are acquiring that kind of capability. So that suggests a pretty big change is needed on our part. And then second, an emerging military revolution. And here the book gets into this rush on a broad front of technology. And again, it's things we hear about, read about, artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, which is basically 3D printing, advances potentially in quantum computing, synthetic biology, hypersonic weapons and propulsion. And one of the interesting things here is that a lot of the application in a military sense will depend on the interaction of these technologies. So for example, if you want a hypersonic propulsion, the way you may have to develop these engines is not through subtractive manufacturing, which is the way we typically do things, but additive manufacturing, because you may have to honeycomb that engine in order to reduce the heat or dissipate the heat in ways that you couldn't with subtractive manufacturing. Quantum computing, enormous potential in terms of designing molecules and modeling chemical interactions, which could have a big influence on synthetic biology for better or worse. So if you're looking at that and you're saying, how do these all fit into military operations, it really leads you in the direction of, this could be a very complex combination of factors that really shape where warfare is going. And of course, if there's this interaction, then it matters which technologies mature first, because then you can add them into whatever your new secret sauce happens to be. So if you buy that argument, and I think it's a pretty easy argument to sell, that given all the changes going on in the world, the military competition is not isolated from that, then you've got this issue of, well, what do you do about it? And let's see here, going on to into the ether.
Next slide.
Let's do next slide. No, we're not getting the next slide. There we go. Both Secretary Mattis back at the start of the previous administration, the Trump administration, and Secretary Austin at the start of the Biden administration have recognized this. And they said, look, we need to really rethink how we conduct military operations. And we need to find out just how these changes apply to our military capability and how we can continue to maintain what some people call an overmatch, but others, I guess, would describe it as a favorable military balance of power. And one of my favorite characters that developed in the case studies I did was Admiral Jackie Fisher. And he summed it up very directly by saying, we can't decide what kind of a fleet we need until we decide how we're going to fight. And basically said, how many of our admirals have made up their minds as to how they're going to fight? And then he says, how many of our admirals have got minds? So he was not particularly enamored of the senior military leadership of the Royal Navy in the first decade of the 20th century. But again, how are we going to fight? How are we going to operate? And again, that's what two recent defense secretaries said at the onset of the last two administrations. So next slides, please. Let's see if we can get to next. Here we go. So what we're talking about is not innovation. We're talking about disruptive innovation. And for those of you who have an interest in this, again, I said this is occurring in society, not just in the military. There have been a growing number of books written about disruptive innovation as it pertains to the corporate sector. Clayton Christensen's probably the most noted one in terms of the innovator's dilemma. But we're not talking about, you're in it's the horse and buggy age, and you're trying to figure out how to build a better horseshoe or a neater saddle for someone. We're talking about the horse and buggy age transitioning into the automotive age. And so if you're going to compete in that transportation environment, you're going to need to dramatically rethink how you go about doing business. And it's the same right now with respect to military organizations. A need to fundamentally rethink, in many ways, how we conduct operations and how we accomplish the missions. there's a relatively high level of uncertainty, as you might imagine, in deciding, well, where do we go? What do we buy? How do we combine these different capabilities? Because again, we're not talking about getting better at what we do. We're talking about doing something quite different from what we've been doing. And so one issue is, how do you do it? And how do you reduce uncertainty? What are some of the best practices for militaries that do this well? How do they do it? How have they done it? Are there any lessons we can learn? And let's see. Here we go. So I did basically two things in the second half of the book. One was to look at trends. What can trends tell us about where warfare might be headed? And you hear a lot these days about multi-domain warfare, multi-domain operations, and so on. Well, we've always had multi-domains. We've always had the land and the sea since the time of Alexander the Great, and when we were throwing rocks and stones at each other. What has happened, though, and driven largely by technology since the middle of the 19th century, is this land and sea domain that we were working on forever has exploded into arguably 8 domains. So the middle of the 19th century, you get the electromagnetic domain, you get the telegraph. Late 19th century, naval operations go undersea, new domain. They go into the air in the early 20th century, a new domain. So we're beginning to enhance or expand the number of domains where military operations are conducted. So multi-domain warfare is not anything new. And then, of course, after World War II, we went from 5 domains to 8. So since World War II, the last general great power war, we've increased the number of domains where militaries operate by 60%, 5 to 8. So we've gone to the seabed shortly after World War II. We've gone to space in the 1950s and 60s. And then more recently, we've gone into the cyber domain. So you can draw on military capabilities from all these domains in order to accomplish a particular mission. Well, which domains do I draw from, and what percentage, what proportion? And you also see this second trend, which really enables this cross-domain warfare, which is beginning around the middle of the 19th century. You see dramatic increases in the range over which military operations can be conducted. Think of the horse and the speed. The horse in the middle of the 19th century moving to the railroad and so on, the telegraph, almost instantaneous communication, and accuracy, growing accuracy. The middle of the 19th century, you have something called the railroad rifle telegraph revolution. And the reason it's rifle is because firepower becomes much more accurate, and the accuracy increases over time. And I think what you see is, in terms of trends, militaries looking to exploit these advances, which favor range, accuracy, and speed. And of course, that has certain implications for how you're going to operate. But it also leads to complexity. So if I want to control the sea, say, within the first island chain, and I'm the Chinese, well, I can draw on military capabilities from potentially all 8 domains. I can have sensors on the undersea. I can have submarines operating on the seabed, submarines in the undersea, surface ships, aircraft, electromagnetic jamming, assets in space to do scouting, cyber attacks. So, what is that complex combination? What is that secret sauce that allows you to do that better than your adversary to achieve the goal that you've set for yourself? And so, looking at those trends, that's one part of it. But then I looked at case studies to say, look, there are 4 militaries I took a look at. One was the Royal Navy, the so-called Fisher Revolution, dreadnoughts and submarines and so on. Second was Blitzkrieg, which is basically the introduction of mechanized air-land warfare between the 2 world wars, informed and coordinated by wireless or radio. The third was the rise of naval aviation, which led to the eclipse of the battleship and basically several millennia of warfare in terms of battleships of various types competing with one another. And then finally, the introduction of the reconnaissance strike complex by the U.S. Air Force in the first Gulf War. And what I would say is my next slide is going to talk to you about the findings, but the findings, I would say, given 4 case studies, are illustrative, not definitive. So in other words, if you don't know as a military organization what best practices are, This will probably improve your knowledge, but it's not as though you have an equation that you can just sort of plug things into and say, well, I've QED, I've solved the problem, I've solved the issue. The four militaries I looked at, one is Admiral Fisher over there, the Royal Navy, the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century. They had a serious problem with the development of a wide range of technologies, everything from undersea cables to new forms of propulsion, to advances in metallurgy, to the introduction of workable submarines and torpedoes. So a very complex environment for Admiral Fisher. General von Zechtier was head of the shadow German general staff after World War I. Of course, they lost that war, and the question was, how could they solve the problem of trench warfare? How could they break out of trench warfare and achieve victory? Admiral William Moffett here. Nobody really knows who William Moffett is. I'm not sure they know who the other two are either. But anyway, Moffett headed the Bureau of Aeronautics in the American Navy from 1921 to 1933. And he is sort of the father of naval aviation. He is the man who pushed aircraft carriers when aircraft carriers weren't necessarily cool. And then finally, we have a guy who, it took me the research on the book to finally figure out who this guy was. His name is Wilbur, don't call me Wilbur Creech. He goes by Bill. Anyway, Bill Creech was the one really who led the way in transforming our Air Force from a service that really, you could say, failed in Vietnam to one that just performed spectacularly 20 years later in the first Gulf War. So 4 services, how did they do it? And were there common features that you could look at and say, yes, this applied across all 4? And goodness for me, thankfully for me, yes, there were, and so I actually had a book to write. So here are some of the insights. Here are some of the things that were common to all these 4 militaries, different services, different nationalities, different time frames. And I'll go over them very quickly. One was a guiding vision. What is different? What is our sense of how warfare is changing? And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is Admiral Fisher said, we've been fighting with battleships for hundreds of years. Now we have torpedoes. Submarines can approach the battle line stealthily. I don't know that, it used to be the only thing that could kill a battleship was a battleship. Now you can kill them with torpedoes, with submarines. What do we do? Same thing with naval aviation. Admiral Sims, who was president of Naval War College, testifies before Congress in 1925 when we haven't even built an aircraft carrier. And he says, astonishingly, aircraft carriers are the capital ship of the future. They are the defining ship in the fleet. We don't even have any. What size does not fit all? This gets down to the issue here of new operational concepts. One vision, one sense of how things are changing and what needs to be done is very circumstantial. So, for example, in the case of Sims, he was talking about 2 fleets engaging and aircraft carriers being basically the defining factor. Didn't really talk about the problem of how you deal with submarines. So again, you have to look at what we would call operational challenges. What's the problem you're trying to solve? And then look at the tools you have available to solve that problem. Another issue was each of these organizations had extended tenure. So Admiral Fisher was around from 1904 to 1915. I told you about the Admiral Moffett, 12 years. Von Seck, that German general who helped to introduce Blitzkrieg, was around for 7. And then General Creech, remarkably, was around for 6.5 years. Most of our senior officers spent maybe 2, at most 3 years, maybe sometimes 4 if you're a service chief. But these people had extraordinary tenure, which allowed them to lay the foundations of something that typically takes, big change takes a long time. So they were able to lay the foundation and generate momentum to where when they left, sufficient momentum had been achieved to keep this process moving. Technologies as key enablers, I think I've mentioned that earlier. New measures of effectiveness. When militaries buy things, they say, well, we buy them because these things are important. And so I'll give you one example. The American Navy, when we transitioned from the battleship to the carrier, the measure of effectiveness was the firepower of a battle line. How many shells could your line of battle, your battleships, hurl against the enemy fleet? Well, it turns out that once you have carriers, that's not the right metric. The metric is how much firepower can you apply over a distance of a couple of 100 miles, because you outrange anything that a battleship can throw against you. Again, with respect to our Air Force, it became not the tonnage of bombs you could drop, but how many smart bombs could you drop? Investment hedges. You don't know. None of these militaries know what was going to be the right answer. And so they hedged. And again, I'll give you an example from our Navy. We didn't know how carrier aircraft were going to be, how they were going to perform, let me say. So the Navy tried 3 different ways. They said, we're going to have horizontal bombers that drop bombs. We're going to have torpedo bombers that come in low and launch torpedoes. And we're going to have dive bombers that come down out of the sky and drop their bombs just before they hit whatever their target is and pull out. It turned out that dive bombers were the answer. At least they were the answer at the Battle of Midway. And so, having invested in a number of options, the Navy had the right one, and it was able to accelerate production of those types of aircraft that were the most effective. And then I'll say little things mean a lot. And when I looked at these, and this is a sort of a link to the need to hedge and the ability to move fast, so time-based competition. When World War II started, the American Navy had something like 500 odd ships. It only had 7 aircraft carriers. When Germany started World War I, it had a couple of submarines. We had a handful of stealth bombers in the first Gulf War. The German army that overran Europe with its mechanized forces, only about 12% of their army was mechanized. Which is kind of scary because you think if a small change can have such a big effect, sort of the nonlinear effect, then it's something that when you sit down to think about, I have this complex combination of capabilities. Even a small, if I put them together right, even a small percentage can have a rather dramatic effect. And let's see, I'll just briefly on this, you're going to face a lot of opposition anytime you try and do something big. And in fact, in each case, this is one of the reasons why, by the way, you need extended tenure, because there is going to be a lot of opposition. Just talking to General Gregson and the departing Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Berger, has faced holy hell trying to engineer a significant change in how the Marine Corps thinks about operating. In the case, I'll just point out, in the case of the Royal Navy, there was actually something called the Syndicate of Discontent that formed against Admiral Fisher and what he was trying to do. His acolytes were called the Fish Pond. I mean, it was like almost like a soap opera. And these were members of Parliament. They were admirals in the Navy. They were people in the business sector, and they all came out against Fisher. And in fact, it got to be so heated that his principal opponent in the Navy, Admiral Beresford, the Prime Minister, held a hearing, a series of hearings with the Committee on Imperial Defense to referee this battle between Beresford and Fisher. It got to that level of heated opposition. One final point, at one point in the late 1930s, only a couple of years before Pearl Harbor, during one of the fleet exercises, the battleship admirals, according to the aviators, had so mishandled their carriers that they filed an after-action report criticizing the whole exercise. The battleship admirals who were in charge told them to, just sort of eat that study. They weren't going to forward it. They weren't going to forward that report. They burned it ceremoniously in the carrier wardroom. I mean, it was. This is brass knuckles, back of the alley kinds of operations in each one of these particular cases. So the message here is not only do you have to come up with a vision, not only do you have to figure out how to pull these new capabilities together, but you also have to figure out how you're going to execute it, because the opposition when you try to make big change is typically intense. And my final slide here, if I could, here we go. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's my best one. So there's an explanation. The final slide basically says, okay, if you buy the argument, if you buy the argument that these kinds of changes are characteristic of what we're seeing now, the U.S. military needs to pursue disruptive innovation. Very, very hard problem. The good news is we don't need to be perfect. We just need to be better than our enemies. The bad news is right now the U.S. military doesn't seem to be following these best practices as I outlined to you in the insights, which was the previous slide. And again, deterrence, which is what we're all trying to do, deter wars as opposed to fight them. That's becoming even more challenging. And there's my little friend. So
thank you,
turn
Andrew.
it over to you, Tim.
It was fascinating, and I think a small sort of like tidbit of what all the goodness in the book. I'd really commend the book to you because it delves into each of these historical case studies in far more detail. And then I think you lay out what's the path forward in a way that's both, I think, illuminating and helpful, but I also felt it was like refreshingly intellectually humble, right? In the sense that you say, this is maybe indicative of what the future could be like, but I don't know authoritatively. I'm not going to try to predict what that future
Anybody
is.
who tells you they can predict the future is peddling moonshine. You just don't know, okay?
Had a question to start off. There's a chapter where you talk about General Bill Creech becoming head of the Tactical Air Command, the predecessor to today's Air Combat Command,
Right.
and how he led a shift from a focus on striking more or less individual targets in red flag exercises to how do we think about defeating air defenses and in turn executing air campaigns. It was a bit striking because it made me think much of DoD's, I think, analytic work right now is very system-on-system focused, when in fact, probably the areas where we need to gain advantage and implement the operational concepts, new ways of fighting that you're talking about, very much depend on this systems destruction view of systems going up against systems of systems. How, based off of, I guess, some of the historical work you've examined and then sort of contemporary dynamics, how can we encourage this shift to a more operational systems-focused view of problems?
Well, as Tim says, systems destruction warfare is one of the concepts that the Chinese have come up with. And one of the problems, and I've looked at this with respect to archipelagic defense, is you can reduce the uncertainty about whether what you're doing is effective or not through things like war games, tabletop exercises like Tim just ran with Brian Clark yesterday. But the best way to do it is to take your stuff out and try it against an enemy that looks like who you think you're going to come up against. And we had a training revolution in this country began in the 1970s, where we took captured Soviet equipment and we began to use that with something called the OPFOR, the opposing force that would fight like the Soviets. They would use their doctrine, their approach to warfare. This needs to be done at the operational level. So it can't be done at the tactical level, the level where you would fight a battle. And Tim correctly points this out. You need to do it at the level at which you would fight a campaign. And each of these military organizations did exactly that. And so to give you an example, the Navy ran 19 fleet problems between World War I and World War II. Some of them covered an area from the shores of Alaska to Hawaii to the west coast of the United States. And our Navy basically split up into two groups, and they fought each other. I mean, all the ships were out there, the planes, everything. We got better at it with the IT revolution, and so you had things like Top Gun, Red Flag, the National Training Center. But a lot of these exercises were done, again, at the tactical level. And at the tactical level, you don't know, for example, am I going to have an air base? So I have my planes flying against this target, and we're trying to figure out how best to attack the target. But that doesn't tell me if I have an air base, if the air base has been destroyed, if I need extended range, and so on. It doesn't tell me how forces from other domains are influencing what's going on. And when I served on the National Defense Panel in the late 90s, we recommended that a joint national training center be instituted that would conduct these operations on an operational level. And so, for example, archipelagic defenses, well, how are you going to defend the first island chain? Okay, well, if you were going to test that in exercises, you would need to conduct large-scale exercises. Nothing wrong with the small scale, but ultimately you need to go to large scale. And in the late 90s, I was talking to Hugh White, who was the Australian version of our Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and we were talking about the need for this kind of facility. And I said, Australia would be a great place for this because you can radiate. If we're going to have electromagnetic battles going on, cyber battles going on, we're going to need a lot of space. And he said, the only reason you Americans don't have that training facility here is because you haven't asked for it. And there's, I don't know if you've noticed in the press the last few days, there's been a large exercise with the Australians, the Americans, I think the Japanese are involved, maybe some forces from India.
13 countries.
13 countries, okay. The good news is that that's a good thing. The bad news is that is more of a demonstration than an exercise. What you would need to do is to say, oh, okay, great, you know how to fire your artillery, and we know how to fire our artillery, and that lands where it's supposed to land, and maybe we talk about how to do this. But I want to see you guys go up against as Tim says, an opposition force that mimics what the Chinese would do to keep us from defending effectively along the first island chain. And this force would have they would have the kind of equipment that the Chinese would have. They would operate systems destruction warfare the way the Chinese would. And we would fight. We would have an instrumented training range, and we would go at it. And the great thing about General Creech is when they started doing the red flag exercises, they would go to attack a target, okay, on day one, and then they'd figure out whether they made it to the target or not. And then on day two, they would reset everything. So it's kind of like Groundhog Day. Day two is just day one all over again. Day three is day one all over again. And General Creech said he raised what General Krulak would call the BS flag, okay? He said, this is not the way we're going to fight. He said, we're going to take down their air defense system. And what we're going to do is, it's called SEED, Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses. We're going to run a campaign. And so whatever we lose the first day, whatever they lose, that's lost. And they said, well, the jamming's really rough, can we turn down the jamming? And I'm old enough to remember, was it Spinal Tap? And they had on their amplifier, they had an 11, they had you go up past 10 to 11. And Creech said, we're going to keep jamming. We're going to because the Russians aren't going to stop jamming. And so fight through the jamming. And this is what we need. I was talking to an admiral not too long ago, 4-star. He said, unfortunately, what we do more is we don't do training and exercises, we do demonstrations. And we're past that point. The opposition's too tough. And the opposition is not at the tactical level where you're going after a terrorist. The level of warfare now stretches from the northern Japanese islands all the way down to Singapore and maybe beyond.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing all that. The sort of another slightly related question is on the topic of this topic of disruption, right? Revolution in military affairs, disruptive changes to warfare. Yet the book talks a little bit about how, in some cases, these new innovative approaches to warfare gained sort of a foothold by convincing the rest of the community of a more evolutionary concept of operation. I think you talked about how naval aviation said, first we're going to scout and provide improved gunnery accuracy to the surface combatants, and then they eventually displaced the battleships. What are some of the implications of that as we consider adopting, I guess, more evolutionary, revolutionary technologies and concepts of operation?
So one of the slides talks about a virtuous cycle. And the virtuous cycle is you do some heavy thinking of, put your big brains to work on this problem, okay? And they come up with a candidate operational concept. This is how we're going to fight to win. And then You do what some of the folks here at Hudson are doing and elsewhere, but you conduct war games, tabletop exercises, seminar gaming, God bless you, that sort of thing. And then you refine it, and you look at it, and then eventually you're going to take that out to the field. And that's where you get as close to war as you can. During this process, there are some evolutionary changes. I've used the term intra-regime shift. I'm sure that's going to catch on. But in the course of these fleet problems, for example, between the world wars, there's Fleet Problem 9, which was conducted, getting the American Navy fighting the American Navy off the coast of Central America. And they had these two carriers that they had converted from cruisers, the Saratoga and the Lexington. And one of the admirals was feeling a little feisty, and part of the exercise, the carrier broke loose and launched an air raid on the Panama Canal. And this, we didn't know we could do this. Now, it didn't displace the battle line, but it said there's a new mission here for these carriers. Aside from just sort of protecting, basically up to that point, carriers were used, their aircraft, to find where the enemy fleet was, and then to help them adjust the gunfire and to prevent the enemy fleet from doing that to us. All of a sudden, you can do raids with carriers. You can strike targets with carriers. This didn't displace the battleship, but it was a new source of competitive advantage. So you can improve the effectiveness within the existing regime. And the way you found that out was primarily through these field exercises going up against an opposing force. So we may not, reinvent the wheel or move from horseshoes to Henry Ford's horseless carriage, overnight. But you do see these improvements, and it is this constant effort to seek competitive advantage. But what you have to do is what's the problem? Is the problem defending the first island chain? Because that's a very different problem than defeating ISIS, which is a very different problem from defending Ukraine. So what is the problem? And we don't have enough resources to solve every problem. So where are we going to place our chips? And once we decide how we're going to fight, then we have some sense of, where do we want to be based? What allies would be more attractive than others? How fast do we need to mobilize? These sorts of things. But we have to decide how we're going to fight and then begin to work through that process of coming up with an answer.
Last question before I open up the floor, if I could, is on the topic of protraction. You've done some work for the Department of Defense on this subject, and I think it's one that's starting to bubble up in the public consciousness that a war could be short and sharp, but it might be protracted, as we're seeing in Ukraine. What are some of the implications of potential protraction, do you think, for force design, mobilization, force employment?
Well, that's a good question. Whatever you come up with, so Germans came up with Blitzkrieg, we came up with carriers. Even if you are as successful as these organizations, you're going to be wrong. You're not going to be perfect. And to give you an example, the Germans reorganized themselves after their campaign in Poland before they attacked France. They made some major changes in the structure of a panzer division, for example, how they coordinated air-ground operations and so on. The Navy, the Navy, again, is just this terrific example. So you have Pearl Harbor, and in the beginning, they had built three different kinds of carriers. They had built 14,000-ton, a 23,000-ton, and a 34,000-ton carrier. Turns out the bigger carriers are the right carriers, so they start making those. Okay, so war reveals what works and what doesn't. The little carrier went to the Atlantic. Second thing they realized was, again, the dive bombers. Okay, the dive bombers were the right way to go. Third is they introduced long-range radio and radar. That changed the entire composition of the carrier air wing from offensive-oriented to defensive-oriented. In terms of so if a war lasts a protracted period of time, you're going to have to make an adaptation in your way of fighting, because you're going to realize that certain things you're doing are wrong. With respect to the current situation in China, so archipelagic defense is my best guess of how we approach the China problem along the first island chain. And I point out in the study, very modestly, this is going to be wrong, okay? I'm not going to predict the future. I'm not going to tell you because there's all these variables we don't know about. You know, did we get surprised? Didn't we get surprised? Is space still up there, or is everybody's satellites gone? You know, so on. So we're going to have to adapt. And so it becomes a case of two things. I think if I were, you know, the two MOEs, measures of effectiveness, one is, can my operational concept be better than yours? You know, do we have a better approach of waging reconnaissance, strike, complex warfare, systems destruction warfare along the first island chain than the Chinese do? So number one is our concept less wrong than theirs? Number two, once we figure that out, who can fix theirs? Who can get theirs right more quickly than the other? And that has to do with things like the industrial base, for example, or you know, how quickly can you mobilize the things you need? And the third is a war with China is likely, unless we blow each other up, is likely to be a protracted war, because as long as we both have sizable nuclear arsenals, and quite frankly, just the challenge of invading and subduing China, it's not like Germany, is beyond our means. And so you have to assume that if we don't go to Armageddon, that this is going to be a protracted war. Okay, how well are we positioned for a protracted war? Well, we don't have a clue. And the absence of munitions is just, you know, one indicator. Another, quite frankly, it's not just munitions. How fast can we produce F-35 aircraft? If we lose a carrier, it's going to take, what, 3-4 years to build another one? If you're an admiral commanding a carrier task force, how risky can you be? How much can you afford to risk that carrier, knowing that if it goes down, it's going to take 5 years before there's another one? So this affects how you fight. You know, if I have to, you know, how risky can I be with this carrier to defend the first island chain, to really push them back? Or do I lose part of the first island chain and then say, okay, well, how do I take it back? What time frame? We haven't really thought through mobilization either before the war begins or after the war starts.
On that happy note, let's open it up to the floor. Have a question right here from the front, please. So I'd just ask if you can identify yourself and ask a question, please.
Hi, Andy. George Nicholson, the Washington liaison for the Global Special Operations Forces Foundation. Quick interjection first. One of the books that you did not mention that he wrote was called The 7 Deadly Scenarios, and I must have given out 50 copies of that one. The question I've got, it seems the past is prologue. One of my favorite quotes comes from B.H. Lyndall Hart, was, quote, "The only thing harder than getting a new idea into the military mind is getting an old one out." And I think that's deja vu. In 1997, I was at the National Press Club when General Krulak, the commandant, made the point that the future is not going to be how we fought at Desert Storm. And he mentions the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, where Various took 3 legions, soundly defeated the Germanic tribes, came back, big banquets and everything else, and Rome, 10 years later, went forward. But the Germanic tribes had learned their lessons so they backed into the swamp areas. The legions followed them in the swamp areas, got mired down, and absolutely annihilated. So basically, in terms of what's happening, what's your confidence level in terms of lessons learned that we're learning from what's happening in the Ukraine? I'm sure the Chinese are looking at what's working and what's not working. I think the innovative things that are being done out there are things like are being done by General Raymond and General Saltzman, what we can do from space. And Secretary Kendall understands that you know, you look at what's the effect you want to achieve and then decide what you do that. But again, the concern of the individuals who are embedded in tribalism will continue to do business like we always did in the past.
Just very quickly, a couple of points. One is I think you're right about space. You know, certainly Elon Musk is, and in the sense the private sector has played a significant role, more I think than was expected before the war. More broadly speaking, wasn't this supposed to be a cakewalk for the Russians? I served on the 2018 National Defense Strategy Commission, and we would get briefed about if the Russians ever went after the Baltic states, boy, we'd be in big trouble. Baltic states are part of NATO. One would think NATO would have come to their defense, but it was assumed that that we would lose fairly quickly. And I think that's, as President Eisenhower said, the only thing he could tell you about war is no war ever turns out the way it's predicted. So I think that's another lesson to be learned from Ukraine when you look at some of the analysis that was done in the run-up to it. Third is the human factor. Zelensky stays. The Ukrainians fight. The Russians don't, in a lot of cases. And I think the human dimension sometimes we lose track of. What do the Marines say, Chip? We don't man the equipment, we equip the man. Yeah. Or the Marine, I guess, these days. So I think this issue of drones, maybe I'm wrong, could be overblown. We had a number of discussions during my time as chairman of the CONO executive panel about drone swarms. Well, one of the big problems with drones is payload. They can only carry so much, especially these small ones. So either you can't fly very far, or you can't carry much of a bomb or whatever you're trying to do. But how you link those with other scouting elements? In the book, I mentioned that how would a drone swarm fare against a counter drone swarm? Or maybe a simple solution is just a shotgun. If these things are small and fragile so they can increase their range and carry, you just throw buckshot up there, and it's a lot cheaper than trying to coordinate a drone swarm attack. So it's one of those things where I would like to see that training center in Australia, and I would like to see how the Chinese, we think they're planning to use drones, and I like to see how they fare in a high fidelity training environment. So, and I think one of the interesting lessons of Ukraine might be, at least in terms of my thinking on the nuclear stuff, is under what circumstances would Putin use nuclear weapons? And you can see there are a number of different situations and options. If I was writing a scenario book now, I might explore those.
Thanks, Andrew. I have a question back right here.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today. My name is Shane Denon. I'm an intern under Tim in the Center for Defense Concepts of Technology. My question is sort of relating to the hot topic of today is AI, and you've spoken a lot about innovation. And there's been a lot of discussion how AI might be applied at the tactical level with information gathering and autonomous weapon systems. My question is, how do you foresee AI influencing the operational level, and will it support decision-making? So yes.
Well, it's certainly a broad question, broad topic. I'll just maybe skim the waves for a couple of minutes. One is certainly you look at what's being done with AI in space and on the ground in terms of just processing all this data that's coming in. And so if I have a satellite and it's hoovering up all this data, I have a certain amount of bandwidth that I can use to move this data down to Earth. And of course, if I move it all, it's going to take longer. So anything onboard sort of differentiation I can do with AI is helpful. Plus, any onboard differentiation I can do will reduce the number of analysts, human analysts, that need to work this problem once they get the data on land. So that's one. Another is, in the book, looking at additive manufacturing, 3D printing, and how that might affect logistics. Okay, when I was in the Army many years ago, we had all these bins of spare parts. Well, if you could print those spare parts, you can have, all you basically need is the powder or the resin or whatever you're using to print them out. But AI could help you potentially determine. In fact, AI is being used now by organizations like Home Depot when they see some sort of a natural disaster coming, trying to model what the effects will be and what the demand will be on Home Depot products so they can begin to position products. So this could be applied to logistics. Since in terms of the trends of warfare, speed and range, basically you're looking at electromagnetics, you're looking at hypersonics, you're looking at cyber, and you're looking at the speed of warfare speeding up. So if you're looking at a cyber attack, there's some indications that not only can AI help in terms of mitigating the damage of a cyber attack, it can also begin to look at patterns out there in the environment and anticipate the attack. So that's another possibility. Another is, one of my favorites, being an old air defense officer, is how do you do missile defense? And my kids, when they were growing up, used to play this, sort of prehistoric video game called Space Invaders. And, these have these guys coming down and you shoot them up. And after a while, it became, because I would play, after a while it became not that I didn't have the skill, I was just wearing out. And so if you have these waves of missiles coming in, a human operator may be able to handle it for 10 or 15 minutes, but not for 30 minutes, not for 40 minutes, not for 50 minutes. And so when do you turn it over to AI? And especially if they're coming in hypersonics and so on. And especially if you have to allocate, okay, so this is a weapon that is going to kill my ship versus this is a weapon that might damage my ship. Or this is a weapon that might miss, this is the one that's sure to hit. The problem you run into is what I call artificial stupidity. You're turning things over to AI and you're asking you to make independent judgments, and the reason you're doing that is because it may see things you don't. Well, it may do stupid stuff too, and you don't know what that stupid stuff is. Others, if you have AI is based on, to a certain extent, data sets. Well, how good is your data set? Is it being corrupted by somebody else? To the extent that you're relying on code, can that code be corrupted? So it's like being at the Cumberland Gap in 1820. There's a whole new world out there, and a lot of it to be explored with respect to AI. The great thing about AI is it can find things out for you that you just don't see are there. In a good way, but it can also do it in a bad way. There was recently there was it turned out to be a sort of an urban legend kind of story, but there was this drone evidently fueled by AI that basically turned on its operator because, like HAL in 2001, it saw the operator as actually undermining its ability to accomplish its intended mission. So, a big deal. It was apocryphal, but again, it was not much different than good old HAL in 2001. So it's, I think I have no idea where this thing is going, but I know it's too big to be ignored, and I suspect at least we've had AI before. We just haven't had AI with the autonomy. And the final thing I'll say on this, because we could have a very long conversation, is the resilience of your battle network, of your reconnaissance strike complex, may depend to some extent on the ability of systems to operate on their own. So what I'm talking about is a drone that not only knows where the target is, can scout the target, identify the target, but if it has lost communications with the battle network, it can make decisions and actually successfully execute the mission. Whereas if you didn't have AI, the thing would just sort of fly around or whatever. And again, that could be an important aspect. And it's a spectrum. How much AI do we introduce into these systems?
Final question, General Gregson. We'll bring the mic.
Chip Gregson, retiree. With full knowledge that at least one of you is a graduate of net assessment, I pose this question. Your examples of innovation were pretty service specific, regardless of which country it was coming from, and all your stories about the U.S. Navy are all hallowed lore at the Naval Academy. The strategy is a necessary precondition. What is it we're trying? What's the ends that we're doing, the ways, means, and everything? But since Goldwater Nichols, the development of strategies and therefore concepts and things has been declared to be owned by OSD, which OSD jealously guards. Innovation comes from services doing a workaround by talking to Capitol Hill and by working on getting weapons systems funded that fit a concept that's frankly still in development. This doesn't seem to be, the unified commanders in here are also created by Goldwater Nichols. You don't see a lot of innovation being driven by the unified commanders, at least as far as I can see. So we have, we've for purposes that were probably correct when we did it, we've essentially tried to take the services out of innovating. And we're going to have to fix that?
Well, it's a very quick story. I was involved with the creation of Joint Forces Command and served on their board for as long as they existed. They came on board around 1998, was disbanded, I think, in 2009. And the idea behind Joint Forces Command was to basically establish this kind of training center, identify what the principal operational challenge was. What are we trying to do? So in this 2023 would be, how do you defend the first island chain? And then force the services to compete so that if you didn't bring your A game, then eventually your capabilities would be shown as superfluous or of marginal utility to how we were going to solve this problem. The problem you ran into is, well, there are several problems. One is the services basically undermined the effort because they saw control being taken away from them in terms, so there's this fight going on between PAD and the services at the time and so on. The second problem was 9/11, which refocused the entire command on getting staffs and so on ready to go to Iraq and Afghanistan. By 2000, when Mattis showed up around 2007, I think it was, he asked me to come, and they had done some terrible things. They had this ginormous J9 shop that had about 80 worker bees there, but what you really needed was, find our Clausewitzes, find our 4 or 5 people who really can think this through, and so that wasn't being done. And you didn't have any extended tenure. So you'd have a GIFCOM commander who would come in for 2 years, a lot of times at most, and then they'd leave. And so you had no long-term vision. The COCOMs or the SYNCs weren't going to give you the long-term vision. They were there for a couple of years. And what I finally proposed, we finally decided to, at least I think, to disband GIFCOM. I said, what you really need is a Joint Forces Command commander, 3-year tour. If he does well, she does well, second 3-year tour, so that's 6 years. And if that succeeds, then they fleet up to be the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs for 4 years, run the Joint, Requirements and Oversight Council. And so you have a 10-year bit of runway there to get things done. But you need top cover from the Defense Secretary and so on. You find that these people, and I'll shut up, but you find that each of these people that I put up here, they're schemers. So Fisher knows people in Parliament. Fisher says we need lots of battleships. He doesn't think they need battleships, but he wants to keep the industrial base going. And he knows that, so he's a political operator. What's his name? It's not Ellis. I keep thinking of Pete Ellis. Moffett. Moffett, he's around for 12 years. The Navy's trying to get rid of him. And basically, when he's on his 3rd tour and going for a 4th tour consecutive, this is you have 1 tour and then you go on. The Navy has to send over to the White House its recommendations for who's going to head the Bureau of Aeronautics. And it gives them a short list. And the White House sends the list back, we need more names. And they give them more names. And Moffat's not on either list. We're going to get rid of this guy. And the White House said, we need more names. And so finally they send over a list of every admiral who is eligible for that position in rank order, with Moffat's name being last. Okay, he's the least, in terms of the Navy, he's the guy we least want to be in this position. And they get a letter back from the White House approved for Admiral Moffett. Why? Because Moffett had been working the Hill. Moffett had made friends with Herbert Hoover, who was Herbert Hoover's friends, who was president of the United States at the time. And that's the way these guys did it. Creech was involved with Gabriel and the Air Force Chief of Staff, so he had an inside track on what they were buying, what the procurement budget. These guys are schemers. They really are. Look at, the guy I didn't even mention was Rickover. Yeah. I mean, the nuclear Navy.
Despite the Navy.
Right, despite the Navy, we're going to have a nuclear Navy. So these guys, they are very attuned to what needs to be done on a professional level, but also on a political level. And that's very hard to do. And of course, they don't do it perfectly, but it is a tour de force in terms of somebody who has a vision and understand what it takes to bring that vision about, or as close to it as they can. You're welcome.
I think we have our work cut out for us, both in terms of
Absolutely.
ideas and
The
implementation.
last chapter of the book sort of looks at these factors, new measures of effectiveness, extended tenure for leaders. Have we identified the problem we're trying to address? The principal operational challenge, and are we building options in terms of procurement, so that we can try out different things when we find out what works and what doesn't. So a lot of work to be done, right, Tim?
Thank you, Andrew. We'll conclude the event now, and then we'll hang around for a bit. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Morgan DeWitt for putting this together, and we hope you have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.